Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Benoît Paré, a French Army Reserve officer and former Defense Ministry analyst. Most importantly, Mr. Paré worked for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that's the OSCE, as part of the ceasefire monitoring mission in eastern Ukraine. He also wrote a book about his experiences in the Donbas with the title What I Saw in Ukraine, 2015 to 2022. Diary of an International Observer. That's what we want to discuss today. So, Mr. Paré, welcome.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you very much for saying yes, because I've been wondering about the OSCE mission and people who worked there on the ground for a long time, because you were quite many people, and there was OSCE personnel on both sides of the front line before 2022, before then the all-out warfare that we're seeing now, because we often forget between 2014 and 2022 you already had a lot of firing and shelling going on, and around 14,000 people, 14,000 who died in that period that we now often forget. Could you maybe start by telling us what was the structure of your mission? When did you go, and where were you stationed, and what was the motivation for you to do this?
Right. So basically, this mission was called the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. It was created on the 21st of March, 2014, right? So shortly after, basically, the takeover of Crimea by allegedly Russian troops, or let's say this just after the massive demonstrations that took place in Ukraine following the what was presented at that time as a revolution in Ukraine, but which many people now see as a coup d'etat, which occurred on February 2014. So this created this coup d'etat. It created a chain reaction with massive demonstrations mostly in Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, which led also to Crimea crisis, like Crimea deciding to basically get its independence from Ukraine with the help of, we believe, Russia. And so the members, OSCE members, which OSCE basically is an organization that comprises all the countries of the Northern Hemisphere, roughly speaking, meaning all the Western Bloc, plus the countries from the former Soviet Union. And Japan is actually like some kind of associate member, not full member, but associate member. So anyways, this country decided to launch an observation mission on the ground. And our mandate initially was to foster peace by encouraging dialogue on the ground and reporting on security events and monitoring the human rights situation. And this was the initial mandate.
May I just add, like, legally speaking, what the OSCE was supposed to do is to monitor these, what was agreed with the Minsk Accords, right? You had the Minsk Agreements.
The Minsk Accord were signed afterwards.
Okay.
Right? So initially, the OSCE mission had nothing to do with the Minsk Accord because it's had a mandate of its own, right? And for people who would buy my book, in the annex, I actually copied the mandate of the OSCE mission. And actually, it's important to specify because once I joined myself this mission, I joined a specific unit of that mission, which was called the Human Dimension Unit. And the Human Dimension Unit was not specifically in charge of the Minsk, monitoring the Minsk Agreement. We were mostly in charge of monitoring human rights violations, which was part of the initial mandate from 2014, March 2014. So I joined this mission myself in 2015, July 2015. But once the mission was created in March 2014, the situation on the ground evolved quickly towards a military conflict. But the OSCE mission initially was not supposed to be like a military observation mission. It was supposed to be a purely civilian mission. But when trouble started in the Donbas from April, I mean, the first observers from the OSCE who was sent over there, some of them were taken hostage. They're arrested by different groups, mostly in the Luhansk Oblast, because the Luhansk Oblast was very much a bit of a mess at that moment, to be frank, because there are many groups that are, what we call in Ukraine, Cossacks, Cossack groups. And the Cossacks, which I found out later, are very independent from any power. They only recognize as a supreme power God, because they are all the Cossacks are usually affiliated to a specific church. And as a Cossack member explained to me once I worked in Lugansk, we recognize only two bosses, God and the head of our unit. But also each of these Cossack unit has its own church. So the main priest of that church is also a leader for them, right? This is how they work. So anyways, they are very decentralized. And so at the beginning, some of these groups decided to, they didn't know who these OSCE people were, so they decided to arrest them and then see later. Now, at that moment, the OSCE mission decided to freeze its own recruitment for a few months. And then the military situation evolved on the ground in a full-scale war. First, the separatists actually managed to take control of most of the Donetsk Oblast and most of the southern part of the Lugansk Oblast. But from the moment the Ukrainian military sent its forces, fighting occurred. And from the middle of July, let's say you could say even like mid-June, the Ukrainian army starting to actually recuperate some territories, like Mariupol, for instance, from the 13th of June. And then the separatists were more on the defensive. And it is believed that this moment that all of a sudden, mysteriously, the situation evolved during the summer of 2014 in favor of the separatists again. And many people believe, even though it was not recognized officially by Russia, that Russian forces gave a hand to the separatists so that they could overturn a situation that had become worrying for them. But this was just enough to make them control some kind of territory that was a minimum size to survive. And then very quickly, because the Ukrainian military at that moment was not well prepared, and they were in a bad situation, so they agreed to sign the Minsk I agreement. So we're talking about September 2014, right? But as part of the Minsk I agreement, the OSCE mission, my mission, was specifically tasked to monitor some aspects of the Minsk agreement, and those aspects were dealing with the monitoring of ceasefire violations and the withdrawal of heavy weapons. These were the two aspects for which our mission was designated in the Minsk agreement to follow.
And let me just ask. So before and after the Minsk agreements, the OSCE had a mandate, which also means that you had the okay from the people on the ground, right? Because for the OSCE to become active, you need to be actually invited. So, and also under the Minsk agreement, you were invited by the Ukraine, you were invited by Donetsk and Lugansk, even though you don't recognize them, or somehow like that. There was an agreement that, okay, you guys are fine, you can come and monitor.
Yes. So we were officially invited by the Ukrainian government, which was the only legal government at that moment. But when you read the Minsk agreement itself, you can see that it is countersigned below by the then heads of the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. They signed
which in your book you say you always needed to write in quotation marks. You were not allowed to
in quotation marks always. Otherwise, it was considered like some kind of formal recognition, right? But they actually signed, and it's also in the annex of my book. There are two documents in the annex. There's the mandate of OSCE mission, and there's the Minsk agreement. But I think I put actually there are different documents when you talk about Minsk agreements, because there's more than one. There were two agreements signed in September, and then there was a third one signed in February 2015. And that was the most detailed document. It's called the Package of Measures for the Implementation of the Minsk Agreement. And that's the only document I put in the annex of my book, because that's the last document and that's the most precise one, right? It's basically actually takes into account all the previous documents, but like pushes them further in terms of precisions, right? So that's why I didn't think there was a need like to put all the different Minsk agreements together in a row, because for us, the only one that really mattered was the last one. It was like a Bible when we were on the ground. Whenever we had a doubt about something, this is the document we would look at, right? So then basically OSCE mission, which was initially a totally civilian mission, once it was mandated by the Minsk Agreement 1 to monitor some military aspects, then it started to shift in its recruitment. And then it started to recruit people with a military or a police background, much more than people with a civilian background. And in the end, I mean, in our mission, we had about 80% of the people who were hired, the observers, they either had a military background or police background, so security background. And you only had about 20% of people who had like a civilian background, right? So the change of reality on the ground made the OSCE mission change its recruitment policy. But even though myself, I had a mixed status because I had both a civilian background in previous OSCE missions, and I also had a military background because I served for 5 years in the French military, although in different periods, because as a reserve officer. And I was deployed, in ex-Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Lebanon, in the military. But while I was working for military, I was also dealing with the civilian world. Usually I was like a liaison officer with NGOs or international organizations, things like that. This was most of the time, this was the kind of job I was doing for the military. So this environment of international organizations and countries at war was something I was very familiar with. So for the OSCE, I was an interesting person because I could like basically be hired either as a regular guy with a military background or a guy with a more, what they say, human dimension background. But because there was a shortage at some point of people with a human dimension background, as soon as I arrived, I was put in that human dimension unit, which actually was much more interesting, I would say, than working as a regular observer, only dealing with ceasefire violations and withdrawal of heavy weapons. Although I also had to do that because we all had to do these like main tasks, which are directly linked to the Minsk Agreement. So I also had experience in monitoring that, but most of my time was spent working on much more confidential and sensitive issues. And these issues were, like, for instance, checking, verifying all allegations of civilian casualties of the conflict, either killed or wounded. From the year 2016, we had a systematic checking of all these allegations on both sides. So it took a lot of actually time and manpower to do that because we had to verify information from 3 different sources. One had to be medical, one had to be from an authority on the ground, and one had to be from either the victim himself or herself, or a family member, or a neighbor who had direct knowledge of the incident. So that was kind of a pretty heavy procedure for us to check all the allegations. But in the end, you could like somehow consider that the end result was reliable, heavily reliable. Right?
So using these 3 sources, that's the protocol that you need to fulfill, the checklist, in order for this case then to count as properly investigated or properly resolved.
And then once we had these 3 sources corroborating the allegation, we, the OSCE, would consider this case is officially enters our database of confirmed cases. Otherwise, it stayed in the category of unconfirmed. And unconfirmed was not something we would report upon. Right? But sometimes we only had 2 sources and we missed one last one for whatever reasons. And sometimes even without the 3rd reason, you could consider, okay, there's no doubt about this case, but because people in the headquarters were adamant we had to follow thoroughly our procedures, we wouldn't count these cases. Just to give you one example, I remember there was one guy in the Luhansk Oblast. According to medical sources, which were usually the most reliable, because in the medical side, they were not supposed to be politically motivated, and they had all information you needed. They could tell you the type of injury, what caused it, the date when the person was hospitalized, and they can give you the name, the address, and the phone number of the victim. All of this you have just with a medical source. But in this case, we had all this information, but then the information was that the guy, once he got wounded, decided to join the LPR, which is the Luhansk People's Republic militia, right? And then he moved out from his place, and so his neighbors didn't know where he was because he joined the military. And we could not trace him afterwards. Even at some point, I mean, I asked my colleagues who were like dealing liaison officers with the LPR militia. I said, well, can you try to locate this guy? But, they had many other priorities than just locate somebody for us. So I never got confirmation about this case, but I had little doubt that this guy existed. And just to give you one example, but this guy was never officially counted in our statistics.
So, sorry, just for my understanding, does that these statistics, the 14,000 dead that we know about that the OSCE counted, those are just the confirmed deaths with all of these three sources? Or is that a separate thing that we are talking about?
The figure of 14,000+ is not a figure that OSCE compiled, because we only started verifying systematically the victims from 1st January 2016. Oh. But in the initial 2 years of the war, 14 and 15, there were many casualties because it was open warfare. But we have not, sometimes because we were not on the ground, we have not verified those casualties. We only started to do that systematically from 1st January 2016, once we were better organized on the ground. But the UN, otherwise, the figure of 14,000 actually is mostly a figure that UN people estimated based on their own assumptions.
Okay.
And you can actually find this on Wikipedia, and they even actually split this number into how many civilians died and how many separatist combatants died and how many Ukrainian soldiers died. And I also mentioned this in the epilogue of my book at the very end, because it's like the only kind of neutral statistics we have about the conflicts. Even though the UN themselves would say they are not like absolutely precise, right, about these figures, but that's the most accurate figure we have. And from recollection, basically you had around 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers dead, about 6,000 separatist combatants dead, so it means 50% more, right? And the rest are civilians. So from recollections, it's 3,500 around civilian dead during this period. And this doesn't take into account the wounded, because the wounded usually are 4 times more, right?
Yeah.
When you count dead people in the military conflict, you need to multiply by 3 or 4 to get the number of wounded people.
Yeah. So the conflict was pretty bad, and even when you were there, you witnessed these breaches of the ceasefire. I mean, in your book, you also write about even the day you arrived in this first hotel, you heard how obviously there was a breach, but nobody investigated. Can you tell us a little bit, because you were stationed then in the Donbas, so you were on the other side. You were not on the Ukrainian-controlled side. You were on the side of the separatists. I mean, as in stationed there, but as an OSCE officer, of course, you were neutral. You were just observing, and that was your mission. Can you tell us a little bit about those experiences and what went on there?
So the mission in Donbas was deployed on both sides, right?
Yeah.
And we had 2, we call that teams. We had one team in the Donetsk Oblast and one team in the Lugansk Oblast. Each team had different offices. In the Donetsk Oblast, we had 3 main bases. We call that hubs. And one was in Mariupol, another one was in Kramatorsk, and the third one was in Donetsk. So Mariupol and Kramatorsk at that moment were on Ukrainian-controlled territory, and Donetsk was, of course, in separatist territory. And in the other oblast, which is Lugansk, we had 2 main bases or hubs. One was in Lugansk, meaning on separatist territory, and the other one was in Severodonetsk, which was the part of the Luhansk Oblast that was controlled by the Ukrainian government. So it's very important to specify we were equally actually dispersed on both sides. Now, as far as I was concerned, I was one of the few observers who had a chance not only to work on both sides of the line of contact, but also to work in both Donbas teams. I worked both in the Donetsk team and then in the Lugansk team, which gave me a pretty wide overview of what was going on, and very few observers had that opportunity, I have to say. And then, even when I was part of a Donetsk team, I worked first in Kramatorsk and then in Mariupol on the government control side. But I also had occasions to work on the other side, because from Mariupol, we could actually monitor the southern part of the DPR, which is Donetsk People's Republic. And we were going there on a regular basis. And also made several trips to Donetsk city for various reasons. So that gave me quite another look. And then when I joined the Lugansk team, I was based in Lugansk city, so on the separatist side. And once in a while, I did travel to Severodonetsk on the other side. And I could see the reports, the patrol reports, because I was in a position actually where I was compiling weekly reports for the human dimension unit, right? So not only I had my own first-hand experience of dealing with the issues with my own meetings, but I was by function supposed to read all reports from my colleagues in my base, right? All of those that were actually had a link with human dimension. It was a huge amount of data that I was exposed to. And actually, the most interesting and sensitive data that I was exposed to was dealing with trials. But that was when I was in the Donetsk Oblast in both Kramatorsk and Mariupol. Conflict-related trials. We, in the human dimension, were following those to make sure that the basic human rights were respected. The right to have a free trial, a fair trial, right to a fair trial is part of the things we were monitoring. But when we were actually monitoring all these trials, it would give you an insight into something that nobody was talking about at that moment, which was how the system of state repression of the Ukrainian government worked. And it was scary. It was a descent into hell. Because from testimonies of all the people who were arrested, I mean, about half of those people who were arrested, from the moment they were arrested or just afterwards, they were all beaten up. I mean, 50% of people claimed they were beaten up. And sometimes this was corroborated by medical certificates. And of course, there was never an investigation of the Ukrainian authorities that could ever confirm that, right? Because it was the SBU doing most of the arrest, but the SBU was the supreme body that was leading all the investigations, and nobody was monitoring the SBU. There was no Ukrainian administration above the SBU. The SBU was supreme master.
So basically, it stayed in the state. It was able to move on its own the way it wanted.
It was a state in the state, and see, the SBU was really in charge. And by the way, what was called the military operation in Donbas by that moment, from the moment it was created in April 2014, it was called anti-terrorist operation. And who was the head of that anti-terrorist operation? It was a general of the SBU. It was not the military. So the SBU was in charge of the whole thing until 2018, when from 2018, the Ukrainian government decided to transfer a responsibility of the ATO, as we call it, to the military. But before then, it was just a police operation manned by the SBU. And the SBU, actually, some of its staff were equipped like the military, right? And they were actually giving orders to the National Guard, for instance. National Guard is basically military units, but which do not fall under the Ministry of Defense. They fall under the Ministry of Interior. And the SBU had power over them, and they even had power to actually give orders to the local military brigade also deployed in Donbas. They had huge power. And they were also, they had the power to arrest where they wanted. And we discovered through our trials that they were monitoring phone conversations of everybody, right? Many people who got arrested and were then put to trial, they got arrested because of phone calls that they were making with friends or family members on the other side, right? And during this phone conversation, sometimes they would talk about the Ukrainian military that it was like based in their own village. So people would say, oh, you know what? Now in our village, at the school, there is actually a Ukrainian military that took over. Oh, really? And then SBU monitors would hear that, oh, you revealed the position of the Ukrainian military. This is treason.
Yeah.
So they would arrest people. And then these people would be trialed and risk years of prison. And then these people would say, well, I was just talking to a friend about, my neighborhood. And my friend is not like an agent of DPR. It's just my friend. That, no. You passed information on military positions of the Ukrainian military to somebody living on the other side. And everybody living on the other side was considered a traitor, right? So you passed information to the enemy. And that was it. And these people were trialed. And whenever these people were trialed, there was no way they could end up being acquitted. All these trials, but one. There were only 2 cases that I know of out of hundreds of cases, hundreds of trials that we followed. And these figures were given to me because I asked by the general prosecutors of the Donetsk Oblast and general prosecutor of the Lugansk Oblast, because I asked to meet these people and I asked them to give the statistics about the conviction rate for all the criminal code articles that they used to arrest people as part of the Donbas conflict. So there were different articles that would use, but mostly they would use the article on terrorism. So in all, as I said, the conviction rate was 99.9%. And for the one case that was missed in both oblast, both general prosecutors told me, oh yeah, we lost in first instance court about these cases, but it's because the local prosecutor didn't do their job correctly, right? But of course, we will win in appeal. And they were proud to actually state that to me, because for them it was a proof that they were doing their job as they were supposed to. But then in one of those trials, I met a member of the Ukrainian parliament, right, the Verkhovna Rada. And this trial was not about separatists. It was about some NCO, some sergeant that was arrested for, it was another part of what was going on there. It was very weird. He was accused of having killed some of Ukrainian investigators who were investigating crimes of Ukrainian soldiers. A crime of smuggling in this case. They were smuggling stuff with the LPR militia, right? Lugansk People's Republic. And so this is another dimension of this conflict, but it's a different story. Anyways, the guy was arrested, even though there were proof that his general was involved in smuggling, but they didn't arrest the general. They arrested a small guy, a sergeant. And the deputy was telling me, you know what, there's a problem in Ukraine because all so-called democratic countries, like from the West, when you look at the conviction rate at criminal trials in their countries, it's between 80 to 85%. And he even told me about France. If France is 85, he knew that figure. So I said, okay, I didn't even know myself. He just told me. And then I double-checked that out, actually. But then he said, but in Ukraine, it's 99.9. So this is not a rate worthy of a democracy. So we do have a problem with our justice system. So even a member of the Verkhovna Rada knew it. And he was not actually a member of the pro-Russian party. He was a member of the party that was supporting the government at that moment. So this was the proof that there is something really wrong with the justice system in Ukraine, as I experienced. So a big part of my book is devoted to that, because it's basically shows that Ukraine, based on that criteria, is not a democracy. It is an authoritarian state. So you could say, maybe, well, it's a country that got invaded. So, if I did not respect human rights, it can be tolerated because the country was invaded, so-called invaded. But, well, this is not the point of view of people whose mandate is to verify the respect of human rights. All right. So there may be other ways than to just violate people's rights and to beat them up and torture them.
Yeah, and you saw this at a relatively early point, right? And you said you could see how things would be getting worse, and we must expect that things became much worse later on. And without being an observer on the ground, seeing people in Ukraine being dragged off the street and shoved into vans in order to do involuntary military service, seeing that the opposition parties are forbidden, seeing that opposition like media is forbidden, seeing all of the reports of journalists who died, even an American journalist in Ukrainian prisons. I mean, at some point it must become quite obvious that there are huge problems in the way Ukraine is administered, and you were then there in order to observe this, but on all sides. Can you tell us, though, in Donetsk and Lugansk, in the rebel held territories, did you ever see similar things occur?
No, when I was on the other side, well, actually, we were supposed to monitor as well. I mean, we wanted to monitor trials because there were trials in the separatist territories. But this is one of the contradictions of our mission. Because we did not recognize any authority in LPR and DPR, as I said, we had to quote them into quotation marks.
You were not allowed to. You were not given.
It was. I mean, actually, at some point we made in 2018, we were supposed to do a report called "Access to Justice in Ukraine," right? And so we were supposed to talk to judges, lawyers, prosecutors, and people who were using the justice system in every oblast of Ukraine. We did this investigation, and that included the separatist territories, but I even experienced that myself, and I tried to visit some local judges because there were judges in the separatist territories. They actually did try to recreate a legal system, even though they were missing staff, but they were trying to put something together. So I asked to talk to 2 judges personally, and I had the same response twice. I cannot talk to you unless I am authorized by the Supreme Judge of the DPR, right? So actually, everybody who was in my position had the same answer. So reported to my coordinator in Donetsk, and at some point she actually arranged a meeting with the Supreme Judge of the DPR. She said, "Oh, I have arranged a meeting, so hopefully we'll be authorized to talk to all these judges." Because it was a very centralized system. DPR, both LPR and DPR were very centralized. And normally they were not trusting people like us because they saw us as spies. That's why they were relying on an authority from the top. So anyways, then my colleague coordinator in Donetsk, actually, she was happy of the fact that she had a meeting arranged with the Supreme Judge. So she called her boss, our boss, in Kiev, and to tell him the good news. It's, "Oh, good news, I have just arranged a meeting with the Supreme Judge." And the guy said, "What?" Yeah, like this afternoon or tomorrow, the meeting is scheduled. And I said, "Well, wait." And the guy called her back 10 minutes afterwards, meaning in the meantime, he talked to some people. And then he said, "Well, you will not go to that meeting." "What do you mean? We just arranged it." He said, "No, you will not go to that meeting. I'm telling you." And then she said, "But we will be ridiculous. It's like we call them to arrange a meeting, and then an hour later, we just call them back to say, hey, actually we cannot come. So we will ruin our reputation." And the answer of my boss, our boss, was, "Well, you don't care. You don't need to care because you will never see him again." Because these people in Kiev had decided that we should never meet people representing the so-called institution of DPR APR, which meant we ourselves, we prevented ourselves from monitoring what they were doing. And at some point, there was a case where one of our patrols, and I saw the report as a coordinator for Mariupol, one of our patrol on the southern part of the DPR, they went in the village, and one guy in the village said, "Hey, My son had an argument with a DPR soldier, and the DPR soldier shot him. But now he will go on the trial, this DPR soldier, for shooting my son. And he said, but I would like you, OSCE, can you go there? And he even told us in which court it was. Can you please go there to monitor that the trial will be fair? I would like OSCE to do that. So I took this report and I sent it to my boss in Kiev and said, look, this is what people want us to do. They want us to monitor how do these DPR people actually manage human rights violations and severe human rights violations. So shouldn't we actually go and attend? And the answer was the same as usual. No, we don't recognize these courts. So you will not go. You will not attend.
Yeah. This is one of the
absurdity of the whole thing. We prevented ourselves from implementing our own mandate for these stupid issues of principle. And, once again, our mandate was like to develop dialogue on the ground and monitor human rights violations. And we didn't do either in this case.
Yeah, right? This is one of the problems that many organizations have, including the Red Cross and others who are working on both sides. Because if the other side, if the Kiev side started thinking that you're recognizing these institutions or that you would be bad PR for them, then they would remove the mandate on their side and take the rug out. So these people on Kiev must have been very careful of not angering their patrons and thereby giving you restrictions, which is bad for what you wanted to do, but it's one of these problems when you rely on both authorities.
Well, this is one possible aspect, but talk about the UN. The UN was also deployed in Donbas with much less people than we were, but they had a human rights monitoring mission, where the UN. And not, for instance, because we didn't recognize authorities, we would not meet them officially, and we would never write to them. Because sometimes when you visited the local administration, you ask for a meeting with whoever is dealing with the administration, and they would actually, okay, can you please send us a letter, official letter requesting for a meeting? Because otherwise we don't accept the meeting. But we would never write an official letter because we would not recognize them, right? But the UN did something different. They would actually issue these letters, but they would send these letters to specific individuals, not to institutions. Mm. And because they followed that way of doing things, they could actually have much more information from the separatist authorities than we were. They could have really established a dialogue. Then the only people who would actually talk to the separatists in our case were the senior staff from our mission in Kiev through a very specific channel, which I learned about afterwards. There was a secret email address on which they would actually send messages to organize meetings, but it would be just for the number 2 of the mission whenever he was visiting. And even the heads of the teams that we had in both Donetsk and Lugansk were not supposed to arrange meeting on their own with the authorities over there. They had to request permission from headquarters each time. So the limitations we had were amazing. And once again, the UN was much more pragmatic. But when I proposed to do things the way the UN was doing it was always rejected. No, they didn't want to hear it. And the UN was not kicked out of Ukraine, But one aspect, though, that corresponds to what you just said is that when I talked to the first head of mission, he left in 2019. He was a Turkish ambassador. And he told me face to face, he said, you know what? I was forbidden by the Ukrainian government to meet anyone in the separatist territories. The Ukrainian government told me, if you meet any of them, we will fire you. We will ask for you to go home. I mean, you see, so the Ukrainian government itself imposed drastic restrictions on our mission, which were going against the mandate, you could say. But they actually turned a blind eye to the fact that the number 2 of the mission would actually establish this contact. Yeah. It was kind of discreet, right? So
It makes
Ukrainian
sense because
authorities.
the greatest concern that governments have when they deal with separatists is to make sure that the separatists never ever get any form of recognition, because they must not be an equal counterpart. They must remain the terrorists, so that you don't even have to follow international humanitarian law if you do that, right? Because you want to portray it's a policing mission, so you don't need to implement the Geneva Conventions, for instance, and it's just that's just how the logic of it works, unfortunately. But then you were on the end, which was constrained, but you were still able to see things, right, in Donetsk and Lugansk. And can you maybe speak a little bit about how you observed these violations that were going on from both sides? I mean, the main question is, who is responsible for the Minsk agreements to not have worked? They were supposed to lead to a beneficial spiral and, everything grow back together again. The Russians never wanted to take Lugansk and Donetsk away from Ukraine. It was supposed to stay inside. Why did it not work?
So my answer would be simple. The side that is the most responsible for Minsk agreement not being applied is Ukraine, just to be clear, by far. Because the Minsk agreement is not just monitoring ceasefire violations and withdrawal of heavy weapons. There are 13 different points in the package of measures. So the ones I just quoted is just 2 points, right? But then there are many other points, political ones, which were for Ukraine to implement. Only Ukraine could implement them. And the first point was like to actually give a status for the separatist territories of Donbas, right? That was perfectly clear in the agreement. Now, there was an attempt to do so in 2015, because initially there was a 1-year deadline to implement everything in the agreement. But it's very interesting that nobody speaks about that anymore now. This is completely forgotten. But on 31st of August 2015, the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, was supposed to adopt the special status for Donbas, which was like the problem from which everything else depends upon. If you don't solve the status of a Donbas, then it means nothing is solved, right? And so you will have a lingering conflict, either frozen or else, but the reasons of the conflict will remain. So that was really the source of everything else, to find a status for Donbas, which we had already agreed upon in writing, but then it was just part of implementing what was agreed upon. So the parliament had to actually adopt 2 different laws in a row. First, a law that actually created the autonomy status for certain territories of Donbas. It was like the way the separatist territories were named, referred to. And then actually, because it changed a bit the governance of the state, the status, you had to change the constitution as well. Now, the first text only needed a 50% plus 1 vote majority to be adopted. But the second text, because it's about amending the constitution, needed a 3/3 majority.
3/4, 75%.
As I recall, it's 3/3, 60.
Yeah. No,
as I recall, but
yeah, okay.
But maybe I'm wrong, but it's for sure more than 50% plus 1.
It's called an absolute majority, either 66% or 75, one of the two. But yeah, an absolute majority, not just the.
Yeah. So what we call absolute majority in France is 50% plus 1.
Sorry,
and then it's like an extra majority, like maybe 2/3, let's say 2/3, 2/3 majority of the parliament to change the constitution. But the date occurred, there was a massive demonstration in front of the parliament. Like, there were tens of thousands of nationalists who were surrounding the parliament to protest against the vote. And there was a police cordon around the parliament to prevent the demonstrators from disturbing the event. But once the news that the first text was adopted came out, one of the nationalists threw a hand grenade at the police cordon, and there were 4 people killed, 3 policemen and 1 journalist, as I recall, and when dozens of people wounded. And there was a big turmoil, and then the news about this incident came to the parliament, And then three parties, which were part of the coalition of Poroshenko at that time. There was also the Yulia Tymoshenko's party as one of them. They just made statements with three parties, but they would never adopt the change of the constitution to allow for a status of autonomy of Donbas. So from that moment, I understood, okay, the Minsk Agreement is dead, right? Because there was no more majority in parliament to solve the main point, which is the status, which is the root of everything else, as I said. And the only hope you could actually adopt this was if there was a change of majority in the parliament. But the next elections were only planned for 2019, 4 years later. So between 15 and 19, nothing moved, right? So, and during this time when the, there were ceasefire violations here or there, violations of withdrawal of weapons here or there, and each time the Ukrainian authorities would accuse the separatists of being responsible for things. But according to our observations, in most cases, it was the Ukrainians who were actually violating the ceasefire. And but we did not necessarily have the means to prove it by that time. It's by when we started to make systematic statistics from the year 2017 up to 2020. And I myself made the statistics that we realized based on statistics that the Ukrainian military shells way more than separatists. Like if you consider victims of shelling between 2016 and 2018, 72% of the victims of shelling, talking about civilians, were on the separatist side, meaning caused by Ukrainian military, right? And it was about 25, 26% of the other way around. But even when you look at the trend from year to year, it went worse, meaning that the separatists were causing less and less casualties, but the Ukrainian military was like causing the same level of casualties. They didn't change anything in the way they were waging war. And at some point, there was even the Minister of Interior, Arsene Avakov, who admitted in an interview in local media, Ukrainian media, that the Ukrainian authorities were following tactics of what they call small steps tactic, meaning they were not like provoking like huge troop-scale offensive because it would be too obvious. They were doing small-scale offensives on specific regions, and he basically quoted Novoazovsk Rayon, which is east of Mariupol, and Gorlovka city, which is north of DPR. So they were attacking DPR both from north and south. And I know both areas really well because I worked on both those areas. And the amount of civilian casualties we had on the separatist side was huge in both these places. Huge. The imbalance was like 90 to 10, even more. And which was like one of the proof that the Ukrainian military was on the offensive in both locations. But I only understood that much later once I read the interview of Avakov, and I said, well, of course it makes sense. It makes complete sense. But this interview was never actually quoted anywhere, even though I wrote to my head of mission quoting this interview, but it changed nothing.
May I ask you? May I ask you some more about, the connection between what was going on the ground and the military developments and the political non-developments? Again, because the Minsk agreements, had they worked the way they were supposed to, they would have resolved the conflict. The Western narrative is, of course, that Russia didn't implement them, therefore they never worked. Vladimir Putin never wanted them to work, he just wanted time. But on the other hand, we also know that Angela Merkel and Hollande and also Poroshenko, they all said the Minsk agreements were supposed to buy us time. The question is, can we believe that or not? Because there's a good argument also to make that no, Merkel and Hollande, that they wanted this to work. They were not interested in a protracted conflict. However, the matter of the fact is it became one, and there was buying of time. And we know now that the CIA established its own bases ever since 2014, also working directly with the SBU, which makes total sense, listening to you, because those were the people who were in charge on the ground, right? Do you think that, or do you have any information about the blocking the political implementation of the Minsk agreements, whether this is an organic thing, because these goddamn nationalists are just like very, very violent. That's Nikolai Petrov's thesis, saying like, look, they're so violent, they're a tiny minority, but they basically deadlock the political process in Ukraine. But then there's another interpretation saying like, no, this is this is the interest of including the U.S. embassy and so on, who wanted to keep this boiling and bubbling. And this is, of course, like one of the things that a lot of people have suspicions about. But what is your hinge of what caused this political deadlock between 15 and, well, now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And if you don't mind, I would like to come back to the previous question very briefly.
Sure.
Another major point of the Minsk Agreement that was never implemented, and only Ukraine was in charge of it, it's the amnesty. There was a point about amnesty, but Ukraine actually never respected this point. The way they were going after everybody involved in the events in the Donbas, as I witnessed it, was the proof that they had no will whatsoever to respect the amnesty. And they even actually put forward a text of law, which was called the Law for the Reintegration of Donbas, which was voted in 2018. In the initial text of the law, they actually said that they will actually sue everyone that was working with the occupation authorities, as it was said in the text. That they will sue everyone, which was a direct violation of the Minsk Agreement. Now, it was so gross that they actually withdrew this paragraph from the text at the request of the West, but they didn't actually, as one member of parliament told me, they didn't write anything about an amnesty, so which gave them the possibility to do whatever they wanted. Right? They still had the possibility to do whatever they wanted because there was no reference to the amnesty. Then access to justice. I told you we're doing this huge investigation around Ukraine. Some colleagues of ours made a very thorough work, especially in Lugansk, about how the LPR, Lugansk People's Republic, judicial system was working, how it was organized. It was a 12-page report, which I read. You know what remained in the official report that the OSCE released? 2 lines. The 2 lines said, since there are no legal, it's not legal, I forgot which, legitimate. So since there are no legitimate authorities in the occupied territories or non-government controlled territories, there is no access to justice in those territories, period. This was the conclusion of 6 months of work. 2 lines. Okay. Now, going back to your question, Minsk Agreement. At some point we started to have meetings between like French observers and the French embassy, like once every 4 months, and then every 6 months. And during those meetings, it was a possibility to actually say more than what was transpiring through our reports, because the diplomats were aware that maybe the official reports of the OSCE is just gives you a limited idea of what's going on. And indeed, it was just a very limited idea of the reality of the ground for various reasons. So they really enjoyed a lot these meetings we had. And it was a chance to tell them much more than what was transpiring in reports. And then even more governments started to organize their own meetings. All the main Western powers did the same. So the Americans, the Brits, the Germans, the Polish people, even the Russians did their own meetings. And then every nation organized its own meetings to have direct contact with its own observers. And it was accepted by OSCE, by the head of mission, because they knew that, with the system, nobody complained about it, let's say, right? And they knew like the reporting system was such that not everything could be written, right? So, and also because, for instance, the Ukrainian government, as soon as there would be something published which would not present it under a favorable light, would usually protest vehemently, right? So, and the OSCE knew it. So that's why like this back channel was like considered a good idea for everyone. Now, in spite of all the information that I could myself, give to the French authorities directly about, the fact that many violations were actually caused by Ukraine, right? Most of them, including like the civilian casualties, as I said, and the figures were very detailed. Now, I never saw any change in the official statements of Western governments. I never heard the smallest criticism of Ukraine publicly, never. So I thought maybe behind closed doors, some messages are being passed, but I had no proof of that, no idea whether it was the case or not. So I had my doubt, and at some point in 2019, I remember I talked to one of French diplomat. I said, "Well, I don't see any change in spite of all the information that you guys have. So how is it the case?" And he told me, "Well, you know what? I don't know. I mean, you know what the information that you and others give us, we send it to Paris. That we don't decide what they do with it, right? So whatever happens in Paris or Berlin, we don't know, right? We don't know what they do with it. It is beyond us, right?" So, but I could see on the ground that there was no change whatsoever from our own governments about the reality of the ground. So, which brought doubts in my mind, which was why it was the case. And then this cold, when we had in 2021, the Russians actually in November 2021, Russians decided to publish officially the diplomatic exchanges they had with both France and Germany, who were the godfathers of the Minsk Agreement, as you know. And these exchanges were about the fact that the Russian side wanted the French and the Germans to try to convince the Ukrainian side to actually establish direct dialogue with the separatists, which they never agreed to do since the very beginning, right? There would, in Minsk, when there were discussions between the sides, they were never talked to them directly. It was OSCE that was doing the intermediary in Minsk, during the Minsk Agreement. So OSCE had a meeting with the Ukrainian side, and then had a different meeting with the separatist representative, telling them this is what Ukraine says.
Yeah.
And then the separatists would answer back, and so forth. It was like this absurd system that was put in place. But and then the Russians was also part of this, and the Russians systematically throughout time, but they were trying to push Ukrainian government to talk directly to the separatists. But the Ukrainian government would say, "No, we don't talk to puppets. You are the puppet masters, so we can talk directly to you, but we don't want to talk to these puppets." So that was their logic. But in 2021, I think Russia had well understood that the Minsk Agreement was dead, because, as I said earlier, the only way it could be revived was through a change of majority in the Ukrainian parliament. And that change did occur in 2019 after Zelensky was elected. Zelensky dissolved the parliament. And once parliament was dissolved, he had absolute majority with his own party alone, right? 50% plus one, with servant of the people, had an absolute majority. And then if you added the votes of the so-called Pro-Russian party, which was like Platform for Life, the party of Medvedchuk, Opposition Platform for Life, Opposition Bloc Platform for Life, they had, as I recall, 2/3 majority to change the constitution and to finally adopt the status of Donbas as was planned in the Minsk Agreement. So I thought, at last, there's a hope. There's renewed hope that this can work. That it never occurred. It never occurred. Why? Because both the nationalists told Zelensky, if you apply the Minsk Agreement, we will end up hanged in the middle of Kiev. And even there was also another document that was revealed at some point. It was called the Red Line Memo, which was published just a few days after Zelensky took office. This Red Line Memo is quite an important document. And I remember reading it at that time because it was like published in the press. It was published by a collective of Ukrainian NGOs. There were about 70 different Ukrainian NGOs. And at that time, I remember reading it. And it was basically saying to Zelensky all the things he could not do. And basically, it was like saying, you cannot change anything to what Poroshenko, your predecessor, did. So it was like tying his hands.
Who was it from?
Well, it's in my book, so I don't remember the name of the NGO actually that published this, but it's written in my book. So somewhere in the year 2019, right? So I was in Lugansk at that moment. So in the part when I talk about Lugansk.
Yeah, so
And
this is
then there's this,
it's this memo that is talked about as being basically the standpoint of the basically the US standpoint of the who funds the
exactly,
NGOs,
exactly.
who then says like, no, we forbid you from actually implementing
Yeah.
the process. But
And I
sorry,
realized,
everybody listening, this is something we need to go and look up. So yeah.
yeah, but I realized about this when I listened to the interview of a guy whose name I forget right now, but he quoted in my book. And this guy actually, he used to work for the US government.
Mm.
And it was an interview by Tucker Carlson, as I recall, where he mentions this. And he says, this red line memo is very important to keep in mind because it's basically the US deep state telling to Zelensky, these are our red lines. This is, and he said basically because look behind, who's behind this NGO that published it. And then I double checked. I typed the name of the NGO and I searched, okay, who's funding them? US government, NATO, Soros organization, all the usual suspects, USAID, you name it. All the US agencies, Western agencies are funding this NGO. So it was pretty clear, okay, they will just obey the masters. And when you read this red memo in detail, and I read it again, it corresponds to every single line to the objectives of the US government at that time about Ukraine.
Yeah, and the implement
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah,
And
we can say from this we have these two levels. We have the political international level, which told the Zelensky government, "Don't you dare," and then you also have the ultra nationalists on the ground who with their violence kind of back that up. And this level says like, if you don't do, then we release the hounds, and
the US deep state knew very well how to manipulate these nationalists. They have done this since the time of the CIA. Back after World War II. It's been a very long history of this. The CIA was maintaining a radical movement of Ukrainian nationalists throughout the Cold War.
Yeah.
And it didn't take much for them to revive this.
We know how much control the US had. I mean, Joe Biden bragged himself on camera that as the vice president, he managed to get the chief prosecutor of Ukraine fired, who was looking into his son's dealings. I mean, the Ukraine became a fiefdom, and there were various levels of control. But, because of the restrictions of time, Benoît, can we go forward also to these fateful days in 2022? When then the incidents increased, and we have reports of the OSCE that the shellings increased right before the Russians decided to intervene. And if we bake that together with your analysis, the political analysis, why did Russia invade? Or like full-blown invasion into Ukraine the moment they did? What is your conclusion there?
Just very briefly, because I did not finish this.
Sorry.
October, November 2021, when Russia reveals the exchanges they had with the Germans and the French, the Germans and the French said, no, we will not push Ukraine to talk with the separatists. So for Russia, it was like a last attempt to revive the Minsk Agreement. And this answer from the French and German foreign ministries was like, okay, they don't want to push for the implementation, and they published it officially to show the world, listen, Germany and France do not want seriously the Minsk Agreement to be applied. So I think that was for them like making a statement. That's it. Minsk Agreement is dead in the water, right? So and then they tried to propose this agreement to the Americans in December, in which the Americans would basically make a commitment never to actually allow Ukraine to join NATO, because that was like a clear red line for the Russians. And throughout 2021, this was like regularly talked about. Oh, Ukraine, will join NATO. It's just a matter of time, but it's only natural Ukraine join NATO. At the same time, the US signed two strategic agreements with Ukraine. One in September, another one in November. And we learned afterwards that part of the strategic agreement was also giving weapons to Ukraine. It was admitted by Antony Blinken. Because he said, we knew Russia was going to attack. But you can see things differently and say, actually, they did everything to provoke Russia to attack. Mm-hmm. Because not only they signed these agreements, which some secret part involved giving out weapons, but they, since Biden was elected since he took office, actually, it's in January 2021, when you look at all the decisions by Zelensky, immediately afterwards, it's closing down 3 opposition channels, 2nd February 2021. Then it's going after Medvedchuk, the head of the opposition, and his main deputy, like accusing them of high treason, which I consider to be like fake charges. And then in March, just 1 month afterwards, Zelensky signs a decree which basically deals with the reintegration of Crimea, like they did with reintegration of Donbas before, and saying that reintegration of Crimea will occur by any means, including military means. So they basically give them the right in writing to reconquer Crimea by military means. And Zelensky signs this, right? So, I mean, it's like when you look at all the decisions they made in 2021, it's everything they could do to provoke Russia, right? First. And then, okay, when in December 2021, the US, actually, I think they answered in January, as I recall, when the US rejects the proposal from Russia to not integrate Ukraine into NATO, I think this is probably the moment when Russia thought, okay, what can we do? And I think probably at that moment, Putin must have thought, okay, well, maybe we should solve this militarily. And actually, I understood on 7th February 2022 that Russia not only had interest to act to first, but to do it as fast as possible. And I understood it. During the press conference he did after his meeting with Macron, which I watched live at the time, because I was in charge of political affairs in Odessa for OSCE. So I forced myself to watch this. And when a French journalist asked him, the question is not whether you are going to invade Ukraine, but when, because everybody was talking about it at that moment, right? And then when you carefully listen to Putin's answer, it was pretty clear to me that they considered Ukraine as a threat, even an immediate threat, because it says Ukraine clearly stated that they consider that Crimea is theirs, but we Russians do not agree. Now, what happens if Ukraine joins NATO and then Ukraine decide to invade Crimea because it considers it theirs? Yeah. Then it means that the whole of NATO will be at war with Russia. And then
I remember that interview. I remember that reply of his where he lays out the logic of why he cannot let that happen. Otherwise, Russia will be at war with NATO. Yeah.
And he says, ask your viewers or readers, is this that they want? Do NATO countries want to be directly at war with Russia? And you understand, because this is what is at stake. This is the risk. And then once I understood that, okay, Americans and NATO refused to opt out Ukraine joining NATO, so they can't wait. They tried everything they could. They see Ukraine is rearming. They signed specific agreements with the Americans. It's only a matter of time before American missiles are deployed in Ukraine. You could have guessed at that moment. So I think they decided, okay, we have to act, and the sooner the better. And I understood that at that moment, and it even scared me. But I tried to push this at the back of my mind. Oh, no, maybe it won't happen, even if there's a logic, I hope it won't happen. And then from the 16th of February, there's a surge of ceasefire violations. Now, if you remember at that time, the Americans, strangely, had announced that Russia would attack on that day. So why did they make this announcement? It's still a bit of a mystery to me to now why Americans decided to announce in advance the day when the Russians would actually invade Ukraine. But on 16th, there was no invasion, but there was an upsurge of ceasefire violations, which was actually monitored by the OSCE. But based on the statistics of the OSCE at that moment, I couldn't tell who was in charge, who was responsible. And then this increase of ceasefire violations continued the following day and so forth until the 24th, actually, when Russia decides to basically launch its special military operation. But it's like an 8 days process. And during this 8 days process beforehand, you see the ceasefire violations, they go up. And initially I thought, well, maybe it's the Russians preparing their own offensive. So my initial idea was that it was the Russians, most likely, who were like preparing their offensive by shelling. But then when I actually looked deeper into the official reports of the OSCE, which I later read thoroughly, and also from discussions I had with colleagues, I concluded differently. I concluded that it was most likely the Ukrainians who were at that moment provoking. And this I got from two different sources who were present in the Lugansk Oblast when the thing started, in Popasna, city of Popasna. We had a local base there. And from a testimony of a colleague I had, he said Ukrainians are shelling heavily from Popasna. And this is how it started. This was confirmed to me by somebody higher up the chain who said, yes, the Ukrainians organized a provocation from Popasna. So I had two sources inside OSCE who told me that. And then when you look at the statistics of the ceasefire violations, and I know very well how they are compiled. I know how it functions. And I know very well also where all the cameras of OSCE were deployed, because we were monitoring a big part of the ceasefire violations with cameras. Now, during daytime, whenever you have our own observers, human observations saying, oh, I heard an explosion on that from that direction, you cannot say for sure whether it's outgoing or incoming. And whether you interpret one or the other, it changes completely how you interpret the information that you have, right? So this is not reliable. In other terms, this is not reliable. The only thing that is like 100% reliable is the data from the cameras at night. Because, you know, when the people shell each other at night, in order to aim, they shell with flares, right? So some of the flares that they shell, some of the shells that they use have flares, which means they can follow the trajectory in the sky, right? And so our cameras could perfectly locate that. And based on the locations of the cameras, when you knew them, which I did, and when you know, because we had perfectly knew where the positions of both sides, we had a map about this. I knew who was shelling whom. And as I said in the conclusion of my book, from every time we had that night cameras observation, it was mostly Ukrainian lines shelling separatist lines. Mm-hmm. So conclusion was that it was the Ukrainian military who, in most likeliness, organized this provocation, as if they wanted Russia to attack. Which is, you know, it's
to the final provocation in order to make sure that now they would cross.
In order to make sure Russia would attack.
And the moment these tanks crossed was the moment when in Washington and Brussels they opened the big champagne bottles, because that's what you needed. That's the moment when you then. And
I concluded that they wanted it to happen, because if you provoke Russia into attacking, then you present Ukraine as a victim in front of the eyes of the whole world, and people only see that. People who don't follow in detail, they only see about, oh, Russia invades without reason. Its neighbor, it's horrible, right? And everybody's shocked, and everybody thinks Russia is wrong, and they are barbarians. And then there was the whole series of specific events, which in most cases, in my view, were organized by the Ukrainian system. They organized provocations, Bucha, for instance, the Kramatorsk train station, which is, I will talk about that in my next book. But because I also investigated these events, and I concluded that many such events are very suspicious in many ways, and appear to me as provocations by the Ukrainian side to portray the Russians as barbarians with whom you could not negotiate. I mean, take the timing of Bucha. Bucha just occurs when Ukrainians and Russians are close to an agreement in Istanbul. And as a sign of goodwill, initially it was a sign of goodwill about Putin, he withdraws all his troops from the north of Ukraine, around Kiev. They didn't have to do it, but they did. On the same day, all the forces left. According to the Russian side, it was a way to show the Ukrainian delegation that they really meant to respect the agreement, which was the best agreement Ukraine could have hoped for, because they agreed to, I even had problems to believe it when I read it. They had agreed to withdraw behind the line of 24 February 2022, which was amazing for me. But they were willing to do that in exchange of Ukraine committing never to join NATO and to downscaling its own military.
Yeah, to do its neutrality agreement, and they were almost there. They were so close.
They were so almost there. And then a few days later, Bucha occurs, and then Boris Johnson comes to visit Zelensky and says, "Oh, you cannot negotiate with Russians. We will help you to defend yourself with NATO weapons, and you will win this militarily." And there were many people, including now, who tell me, "Well, how can you negotiate with Russians after Bucha?" So, cui bono, as they say in Latin, right? Who benefits from the crime? And in this case, you can clearly see that Bucha benefited whom? People who didn't want a peace agreement to be signed with Russia. Those people benefited from Bucha. And again, when you look into it, there are many suspicious things in Bucha. I'm not saying that Russian troops did not do anything wrong. They might have done some crimes over there, but not to the scale of what was alleged. And I think at least part of what happened in Bucha was largely a fabrication by Ukrainian authorities. And this, again, is, I think, demonstrated in my next book.
And there's so much to unpack still. And Benoît, I'm so grateful that you are actually giving us that account and that you wrote that book. It's your first book on your OSCE mission. It's originally in French, but by now translated to English. We need to have a second discussion, that's for sure. But people who want to read your book in English, where should they find it?
Right now, it's only available on Amazon.
On Amazon. Okay. I will put the Amazon link to the book into the description so people can find it. And also, if anyone wants to reach out to you, they can reach out to me, and then I will establish a contact, because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people who are interested in this. We need to discuss again also, because what you witnessed links up directly with people who try to observe other parts of the political developments, including Mr. Kachanovsky on the Maidan, including Nikolai Petro on the overall development of what was politically going on, and it all links back to people who just don't want this conflict to end peacefully, and that's very sad. Is there anything that you need to add at this point?
No, just to say that you quoted Ivan Kachanovsky. I have the highest respect for his work, because I did read his whole thesis very early on from late, actually in 2016. I discovered his work in late 2015, and I read the entirety of it in 2016. And I have the highest respect for it. And I see that you have interviewed him on your channel, and I was happy to see that.
People who are interested in the truth, in knowing what actually happened and why, they will do good work. And Ivan Kachanovsky is one of them, and you're another one. Benoît Paré, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for your invitation.